Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Henderson. I'm the Director of Corporate Affairs and Engagement here at Wellcome. Absolutely delighted to welcome everybody here tonight for this discussion of science advice in a populist age. I just thought I'd say a few words to set the scene. We're in a world where we are all worried increasingly, I think, and concerned about trust and how that plays out in science and the relationships between science and public health and government and so forth. It's worth just starting by remembering that trust in science is still objectively pretty high and pretty stable. So I think that's a good baseline for the discussion tonight. But I also appreciate, I think all of us will not think that trust in science feels particularly high or stable at the moment. There's polarization, politicized attacks, mistrust in many particular fields. And there are also a lot of leading indicators around trust in science and some of the things that might be precursors of trust that are not where we would ideally like them to be. Just to pick out a couple, survey from Pew in the US last year, which found that 47% of Americans feel that scientists feel superior to ordinary people. That goes up to 61% of Republicans. In the UK, some of the Discovery Decade research that CASE, the Campaign for Science and Engineering, have done, finding that only 29% of people feel they know how R&D benefits the UK, and that those figures fall even further to 22% for benefits my region and 18% for benefits my local area, my family and me. It's also, I think, the case that contingent trust seems to be less stable than trust in general. If you ask people, do they trust scientists, do they trust science, they'll generally still say yes. But if you ask people about whether they trust scientists over COVID, over vaccines, over climate change, they're much more likely to give you an equivocal or negative answer. We're very interested in this at Wellcome. We've recently set up a program to start to look at this. We will continue at Wellcome to publish the Wellcome Global Monitor, the global survey of trust in science. The next edition of the Global Monitor will be coming out in the autumn of next year. So please do look after that and look out for that. And then we have a suite of activity that we are putting together to look at different aspects of trust, how we may understand it and promote it, bringing together researchers, practitioners, communities, and others, reviewing, testing, evaluating what's effective and how those kind of more effective mechanisms may be able to be deployed for public good. Some of the things we're doing, we're supporting a Lancet commission run by Georgetown University to look at the links between faith and trust, particularly in health settings. We are running some pilots of digital interventions to explore trustworthy conversations between people who may disagree with each other. We're looking at some work on trustworthy communication and how that can be done best, and how we may synthesize some of the best evidence in this area and make that more useful and actionable. Finally, just a very brief taster, something that we will be publishing quite soon. We've done some polling and focus groups with More in Common in the UK about public trust in science across their segmentation, which I think is going to be very interesting and a very rich addition to the body of knowledge and understanding about this. That's not ready for publication yet, but it's something that you should look out for because I think it will be very helpful. I'm going to hand over to Geoff Mulgan now, who's chairing us tonight, and come sit down. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks, Mark, and thank you for hosting us. Thank you for coming out on a very miserable Monday in December, but at least it's not raining in here. I'm from STEaPP at UCL. My main job this evening is sort of air traffic control and also making sure you all become part of the conversations, because we've got a lot of very knowledgeable people in this room. And I hope we can dive into both the diagnosis and actually some prescriptions, some answers as well. We call this science advice, but it's science advice in the sense really of a triangle where there's science, there are kind of decision makers, politicians, officials, but also business, and then there's the public. And you have to think of all three of those as interacting. And with a sense of fragility. As Mark said, in the US, Republican voters have become dramatically less confident in science in the last generation. That hasn't yet quite been followed in Europe, but it could be. One of the polls you decided, I think, from Case showed that only 9% of people in Britain think publicly funded R&D benefits them directly, which is a remarkably low level. And there are lots of straws in the wind saying that suggesting we might not be getting the ways of communicating or talking about science quite right. Last week in, I think, Washington, Robert Kennedy hosted MAHA. Nature wrote about it, Make America Healthy Again gathering of his kind of community, which had almost no traditional scientists, as it were, in it. We have people like Gwyneth Paltrow and many others using this very interesting formulation, do your own research, by which they don't mean do an RCT, they mean go on the internet and find the rabbit holes which will confirm your views. And before I bring in our fantastic speakers, I thought I would quote Russell Brand from a few days ago. He's probably not often quoted in this building. Comedian, actor, celebrity, in 2016 voted by the readers of Prospect magazine the fourth most influential thinker in the world. After a few charges of assault and rape, he's now reinvented himself, and a few days ago made this comment, because he's reinvented himself as a science skeptic, with enormous audiences in the US lapping up what he says. He says, the new totalitarianism doesn't goose step. It arrives like a gentle fog slipping under your door, wearing a caring smile that whispers, we're only here to help. They become wizards at centralizing information. Then you, yes, you reading this right now, and he means his audience, help to crack their monopoly. Now watch them frantically rebuild the cage, smearing, deplatforming, fact-checking into oblivion anyone who speaks unapproved truth. Now I think all of you are what he's talking about. You are the kind of guardians of approved truths. And the question is, how do you respond to people like him getting very large audiences? So we're going to have a few first comments from each of our panels, a bit of conversation, but then I'm keen we all collectively talk about how best to understand what is the nature of the challenge, the problems, and what might be new tactics, new strategies, new approaches, new structures even, which can help us keep a healthy relationship of science to decision making. So we're going to start with Helen, hope you're ready, with a microphone, senior editor at Nature and author of a forthcoming book out in a few months. Yeah.
April, is this on? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Thanks, Geoff. Yeah. My name's Helen Pearson. Yep, I'm an editor for Nature. I'm a science journalist. I also teach science journalism at UCL, and I'm an author of 2 books. So I guess in my remarks, I just wanted to sort of lay out my perspective. So I guess my expertise, like a couple of the people on the panel here, is as a science journalist who knows or has experience of what it takes to put out accurate information in this world. So the enormous amount of work that goes into reporting, editing, fact-checking, and publishing accurate information within this tide of misinformation that you're talking about. And also I report for Nature on fields which are really wrestling with misinformation in particular. So for example, in the last year on vaccine hesitancy, autism, partly on the MAHA movement and others. And I've reported on more broadly on fields which have embraced evidence or struggled to embrace evidence. So I thought I might set the stage by just actually giving a prime example of the problem that we're facing, which has happened in the last few months, which was, I don't know if many of you watched the rather extraordinary press conference led by Trump over autism and Tylenol or paracetamol here. And if you haven't, then I strongly encourage you to do it, because it was, I just felt like it encapsulated everything that we're discussing. So effectively, we had the President of the United States, we had RFK Jr., the Health Secretary, head of the NIH, head of the FDA, so the leading scientists, effectively scientific authorities in the US, all putting out basically misinformation about this supposed, or what they were saying was a link between taking Tylenol in pregnancy and autism, which was interesting to me, having we knew this was coming at Nature, many people did. I spent about a month more actually reporting a more authoritative piece about what's really causing the rise in diagnoses of autism, which is actually increased awareness and better detection. So it was just a kind of incredible scene, I felt, and it illustrated some of the barriers to overcoming misinformation and perhaps also some of the opportunities. So what we've got at the moment is kind of people in extraordinary positions of power, I think, putting out misinformation because it wins them power. So if they can win more votes and influence by putting out alternative facts, then what's the incentive for them in talking about real facts? So I feel like misinformation has become a route to power. And the autism case study kind of showed that, because these people were speaking to their populist base, or the people who are suspicious of the elites or the conventional scientific information. I think it also illustrated the power of social media, and I know this isn't going to be the first time that comes up tonight, which amplifies all of the misinformation that was being put out, makes it very difficult to filter fact from alternative fact. And I've certainly interviewed specialists recently, I've been writing about ADHD, who've actually said to me, we feel like we are losing the narrative compared to online influencers who are just churning out largely, well, partly inaccurate information about that disorder. But then I also felt like I emerged from the autism Tylenol debacle with a small ray of hope, because we published a story, because we knew this was coming, published a story just as the press conference was happening, talking about the actual science, which of course does not substantiate a link between Tylenol in pregnancy and autism. And we saw that story go absolutely off the charts because people were looking. I mean, there are people out there who want the information, but as journalists, it's very difficult. I mean, we're trying to put out, it's a lot about timing, when you publish your story, do the algorithms that we don't understand on social media decide to favour your story? So an opportunity there, but also enormous difficulty.
Thank you very much. I'm sure come on to some of those rays of hope. Tracey, do you want to take the mic?
Thank you. Thanks, Geoff. I'm Tracey Brown from Sense About Science. I want to look at something which I think is more of a threat and less of a threat than we're suggesting. The first is, I think the future's here. Right, it's as people say, it's just unevenly distributed. So instead of looking for Nigel doing a Donald in the future or another RFK, what's the UK version going to be of that? It's actually here already. We have politicians who don't really do politics, and all the while politicians don't do politics, science and statistics become vulnerable to becoming the focus of people's frustration with stuff that doesn't work or reports that don't seem, that's your GDP, Minister, is something that will come out time and time again. So whether that's frustration that will be directed at the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, or whether it's frustration that will be directed towards a science advisor for advocating for a public health intervention, that's always a risk to the research base and science advice, all the while politicians don't have relationships with the public. So I think we need to recognise we're already dealing in that world. It doesn't take a Tommy Robinson rally or a Nigel Farage election to get us there. I appreciate, that as we sort of intensely move towards a less reflective, more reactive environment, scientists are right to be worried that things that are normal parts of deliberation can become weaponized. Things like uncertainty, changing your mind, that peer-reviewed paper shown to be wrong. Those things can take on a life of their own. And, we look at the way that funding of scientific research was kind of parodied by the Musk intervention, and imagine what that's going to look like. On the other hand, I think not everything is flowing in the same direction. We do have opportunities. I see a lot of commonality in the sort of period that we're in, particularly in Europe and North America, amongst people who just want stuff that works. They want to know how the sums add up. They want to have evidence for things in their lives, and much more than we think. And I think there's a tendency at the moment, and I'll come on to this challenge, there's a tendency to look around and pick out those examples of, oh my goodness, can you see this terrible, like, Gwyneth Paltrow latest candle or something, and imagine that actually that it typifies most people's attitudes to the public, to public life. And I always remember in 2016 when post-truth entered the dictionary, I looked at that and I thought, but this is also the same year that 96 families, this is going to be dear to your heart, as I'm a Liverpool supporter, 96 families won a near 30-year battle for the truth, which took them, that's the Hillsborough families, which took them through understanding blood gases, the tensile strength of fences, statistics, concrete stresses. And I bet you every single one of them said they didn't like science at school, or they didn't like the types of scientists they see on TV. But they really put themselves to science when they could see that it would help them ask their questions. And so I think we need to be careful about that. There is an opportunity. We run Evidence Week in Parliament. It's opened by the public. We had 500 questions from all over the UK on everything from whether the tax sums add up to why does government abandon things like heat pumps? Is it because they didn't work, because they never told us? Or is it because it's too expensive? Or people are interested in good explanations. And so I don't think everyone's just abandoned reason. So I just think they don't get very far with those questions. So where we're going to do well, I think, is if we can encourage the science establishment to, first of all, make good distinctions between what's testable and what's pollable. So a testable question is, a pollable question would be, I think that, Bradford should host the Olympics because it's a really cool thing to do. That's a value statement. You can decide whether you agree with it. You can do a public opinion poll, right? A testable question is, I think Bradford should host the Olympics because more kids will take up sport and that will reduce childhood obesity. That is a testable question, and we're right to get the scientists involved. So I think understanding, I'm not just saying stay in your lane, but I am saying stay in your lane. And I think the other thing is to stop othering the public, right? People can really feel when you are holding them up for ridicule, or just because they ask a question in a clumsy way. And that's one of the things that I think is likely to cause people to turn on scientific institutions. Especially, I've heard people using war language, sort of almost imagining we're in this sort of polarized world in which science is under siege. We've got to get back out there and fight. And I think this is quite worrying to me, that we are sort of othering people. And just finally, I would say, when we were working during COVID with people who were minded to conspiracy theories, we worked with them to figure out how to talk with them, they told us. And one of the things that struck me was I was directed to look at an old Michael Moore documentary. Michael Moore, I think he came from Ohio, actually. But he went back and found someone who was an arch conspiracy theorist who was putting out loads and loads of stuff and was asking him, like, how did you get to this place? And he thought he was on completely opposite sides, and on climate change and so on, and found that they'd actually grown up together with a really similar view of authority, and they asked similar questions. They just ended up picking up on different answers. So let's not other people. Let's think about how to equip their skeptic in a better way.
Thank you very much. And I think this point of if you make the public the problem, they will become the problem without any doubt. Deborah, why don't we go to you, because you're sitting next. I should have said, by the way, Helen's book is Beyond Belief, How Evidence Shows What Really Works, which hopefully, if Tracey's right, people do care about. And Deborah, who's here as LSE, but also former BBC journalist, also has a book, which she's going to wave shortly, called Bad Influence, How the Internet Hijacked Our Health. So over to you.
Thank you. So it very much builds on really what Tracey was saying. And how this book came about, I think, is possibly germane to this discussion. So it was 2023. I'd left ITV News. Alok also worked there. I was totally burnt out after reporting on the pandemic and other stories at Newsnight, and then I went to ITV. And that summer, I was being asked by friends, who are not non-science backgrounds, but they're not mindful, they're not the people that are prone to conspiracy theories or going to turn to necessarily Gwyneth Paltrow to see what she was doing. But they were looking for ADHD diagnoses for their kids. They were looking at how to get health checks. They were looking for HRT, as is the age group, you know, some contraception for their kids, that kind of thing. And they were turning to social media. And they were asking questions, the kind of questions that I ask in my day job, as in what's the evidence of benefits and harms for this particular intervention? What is the level of evidence? Is it backed by meta-analysis, systematic review, randomised controlled trial, observational data? Who's funding this particular post on social media? Where's the money going? And they were having to almost turn themselves into mini journalists just to get the information. This is not their background. And they were awash in a sea of conflicting information. Now, I think it's worth bearing in mind, we do have the extremists here, RFK and some of the Russell Brand, we've come up, who are at the extreme, Gwyneth Paltrow. But there's a lot of middle ground there. They tend to be at the extreme, conspiracies and disinformation. But there's a whole load of bad other stuff out there. And effectively what social media platforms are, whether that is Facebook, Insta, hopefully I've got the lawyers on tap here, Insta, TikTok, are shopping platforms that are designed for retail, to buy, to sell, for entertainment. And I wondered, what happens if you put health on these platforms? How is it shaping our health? I've long reported, before I was at the BBC, I was investigations editor of the BMJ. I've worked in peer review on the BMJ. And for a long time, we've looked at conflicted science. You go through the peer review process and you know the papers that you reject are going to end up somewhere. You talk about conflicts of interest. You have to declare, you're supposed to declare, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors have a code of declarations you're supposed to declare. But we've been talking about all this stuff for a long, long time. Now, all of a sudden, this is all up on platforms. We've got a term in medicine, key opinion leaders. They're the people who are appointed to have a certain, by industry, to propose a certain view. All of a sudden, influencers are perhaps our new key opinion leaders. And it's really hard for people to know what is what. You've got a whole new platform. I like to think of, if you're in the public health world, commercial determinants of health meets the digital determinants of health. So you've got all these new players and a whole new marketplace online. They are the big tech companies. And they can do something if they want to do something. We only need to see the shadow bans of abortion advice from Facebook, although but they deny it wasn't a shadow ban, just because I know this is being broadcast. Or when there was a threat that TikTok was under Biden and then Trump, that TikTok was going to have to be disbanded. They cleaned up their act and got rid of weight loss content. That all seems to have come back. So looking at conspiracies and stuff is the absolute extreme. But here we've got this middle ground of really murky, wrong-headed advice, cherry-picked information, partial information, benefits or harms that people are having to navigate. And actually, quite a lot of, and this is where I wrote the book, quite a lot of it are by scientists, they're by doctors. There are people that are using these platforms to sell. And so when we talk about conspiracy theories and misinformation and things like that, we need to, it's classic follow the money, isn't it? We need to look at the space, I guess, the ecosystem where people are making their decisions and work out, well, how do you navigate that? And I speak as someone with a medical background. As doctors, you're not going to change this. How is this shaping our expectations? How is this changing even how we diagnose illness? How is it shaping how we actually classify illness? These are all big questions, and in some ways we've got a big public health experiment at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see. And there's an absence of data. I draw on a lot on marketing surveys, PR companies, because we know academics, you've got to go and get ethics, you've got to go, get funding. And Michael Marmot said to me, if you're Mars, you can go out and do market research like that. But if you're an academic trying to do that, you've got lots and lots of hoops to go through. So as kind of academics and scientists, we're further behind the curve to know how these things are actually shaping our health and shaping our research agendas and disease descriptions and are actual doctor-patient relationships and things like that. So there's a bigger world besides frank kind of conspiracy theories.
Fantastic. Maybe all of you might think, what should we be doing in terms of experiments and market research to find out, how best to respond to this situation? What is the evidence on evidence, the science of science, which Rory, one of our hosts here this evening, is very engaged in. So our next speaker is Alok Jha, who's currently senior editor in The Economist, but a background in TV, dealing with mass audiences and the same issues as Deborah. Alok.
Thanks, Geoff, and thanks, Deborah, and everyone else who's spoken so far. I'm a science journalist, currently work at The Economist. And in thinking about the topic, science advice in the popular age, populist age rather, I kind of had a thought, which is, I don't really give science advice. I don't give science advice. I'm a journalist, I write stories. But there's a sort of similar mechanism that I'm operating on, which is persuasion, right? It's persuading people to read something and to believe what I'm saying based on evidence and all of that. And I think the core of it comes down to the same thing as giving science advice, which is if you want to persuade someone, if you want your advice to be listened to, you need to start by respecting the person you're talking to. Okay, now this sounds easier than perhaps it is. So how do I go about doing that? Well, there are some practical things that I think about when commissioning stories or writing them or editing them. First is that I think treating your audience like grown-ups is is a sign of respect. So that means things like complexity don't have to be sort of thrown away when you're talking about complex things. And I'm going to use examples from the pandemic because I was involved in covering that. But also this applies to artificial intelligence and other public health issues and autism and all these things, which I've also reported on and edited on. But during the pandemic, we spent pages and pages and pages talking about, for example, the evolutions of viruses or the very complex molecular biology of the spike protein, how you ventilate rooms properly, like literally thousands of words, pages and pages. And you might think, oh, that was kind of something we just did without any understanding of, we just had to fill pages, right? And you kind of write in some respect, but also people read this stuff like a lot and responded and would read to the end. We had metrics to show that people would read all these things. We covered the politics of vaccination. We did very deep dives into how large language models actually work and like what the numbers are. We did all sorts of animated graphics on how the words are converted into tokens, are converted into numbers, then matrix multiplied and all these things, and really explained things in a way that I think is giving people information in a way they can understand, hopefully, but also a framework for thinking how to sort of think about this stuff for themselves in the future. I think the second step of being sort of respectful is to be open. So on the science side, again in the pandemic, there was lots of science being published all the time. And it was open, it was on Archive or BioArchive, all these other places, Nature, Science, all these places published open science, right? Then some of this science turned out not to be right, and then more science was published and there was more debate. And of course that happens in science all the time, but it just usually happens behind closed doors, and then it's put out into the public when it's more finished after peer review or whatever other processes there are. This was happening in real time during the pandemic and people saw all of this. And you might think that means people thought, well, what on earth? These people don't know what they're doing or how they're talking about, they're not coming up with conclusions that make any sense. But actually, you found that people, our audience anyway, were sort of a bit more receptive to the idea that knowledge sort of is an evolving thing. And if you quickly fix it, if you quickly change it, if you quickly or relatively quickly admit your faults and publish again that something correct, then it builds trust, actually. So it's a much better way of building trust than just having a tablet of stone. And this works for journalism too. So in journalism, I've always worked in places, and I still do, where if we are open with our mistakes. If there are mistakes, well, we'll try not to have mistakes, but if there are mistakes, we're open about them, we quickly fix them, and we acknowledge those mistakes. That transparency is something that allows people to understand, A, that we are human beings, that we try our best, and that we will fix things, and we're not sort of brazen in just keeping things published if we know that they're correct or if the evidence suggests otherwise. It also builds authenticity because ultimately as reporters you are not an expert in something, so you're going to have to learn. So if you can learn and show that you're learning alongside your audience, that builds authenticity, because I'm trying to show to my audience, look, I'm learning with you on this. With the pandemic, it was obvious, but it's true in all sorts of other subjects as well. Look, let's try and learn this thing together. I'm going to do my best to speak to the best people, give you this information, and if it turns out not to be quite right, or there's an update, I'll give you the update too. But we're learning this together. You know who I am, and I hope that you're somebody who will acknowledge that this is an imperfect process, but we're all learning together. It's a dialogue. We have better mechanisms of doing it nowadays as well, with things like newsletters, with comments we don't have on the website, but we have things like newsletters, and people write into those things. We feature those comments. People are talking to us all the time. I feel like this is the flip side of not preaching to people. You know, I feel like as journalists, we learn information, we give it to you, and we give you the caveats. But I'm not preaching. I'm not saying to you this is true and just don't ask me any questions about it, or you're not allowed to have your own opinions about something. And I think the same should be true for science as well and scientists. And remember, I think for scientists, something that I tell colleagues and others who speak about this stuff, remember what it's like not to know something. And as a scientist, you've spent 20, maybe 30 years becoming an expert in one field of something, and maybe you know lots about other fields too, but you spent a lot of time training yourself to basically not think like a person. And so remember what it's like to think like a person when you go back into the world and use that information. Of course, the importance of not thinking like a person gets us all sorts of benefits when it comes to science, right? But if you want to persuade people, if you want to respect people, remember that they don't have that luxury of expertise. And it's the same for journalists as well. I've spent months maybe researching a story. My audience hasn't. So I can't treat them like some people who should just know stuff because you know, just because I've spent ages, they should know already. And the one final thing, it's accessibility, right? So I've talked a bit about this already, which is, you know, we're much more accessible as journalists to our audience, and hopefully they get to know us that way. But during the pandemic, one thing we did, and we found again had a really, really strong impact, was to make information accessible. So obviously that means stories and scientific papers and stuff, but data as well. So we, along with organizations like the New York Times and the FT, really led the way in actually publishing loads and loads and loads and loads of COVID data when it came to immunizations or tracing the numbers everywhere. Public health institutions didn't do this, by the way, and they didn't have one coordinated place to do it. Estimates of deaths didn't happen until many, many months after it was useful to have this information. We did it imperfectly with help from experts. And this accessibility of data meant that our audience were using this information genuinely, using the information we were providing through articles, not because it was journalism that they just wanted to read for leisure, but it was practically useful to them. And so it didn't matter. They weren't questioning things and in the same way that you might if you just come across an article. This was useful information to them because it was useful for their lives. And I think that that's fundamentally the most important part of it. So accessibility, making other information accessible, is also a really important part of it. And I think that the coronavirus, artificial intelligence, all these things show us that really good science reporting on a moving topic helps people understand in real time and build solutions for themselves. And I think that's the way you persuade people. That's the way you get people on board.
Thank you very much, Alok. Those are really clear points, and we all need to learn to think like a person. But perhaps we can come back. I've got one question, not for now, but we'll come back in the round. Whether it's issues like face masks in the pandemic or problematic climate models, where this audience sees science as a continuous iterative process of finding better answers. How do you segment the population? We talk about the public in general, but there's lots of analyses showing quite a large minority are very happy with that, very happy with ambiguity, very happy with uncertainty, and there's another large group who absolutely hate it and respond in opposite ways. So do we not need to segment our discussion to be more fine-grained? Not least in the US, where I think the latest data is 35% of the public can't do the most basic mathematical reasoning. So if a number is put in the media, a third of the population now, it was a quarter 10 years ago, simply don't know how to understand it. Anyway, Chris, over to you for the academic perspective on this.
Oh, crikey. So I think the reason Geoff asked me to come up here is he got wind of the fact that I'm working with a bunch of colleagues across 5 continents to write a commentary on exactly this topic, science advice and populism. A couple of them are actually in the room today. And we haven't really talked about what science advice is or what populism is yet. So I'm just going to throw in sort of how we're thinking about that before I go on to what we're going to say in this commentary, give you the preview of it. Science advice, from our perspective, we're talking really about that network of sort of ecosystem of bodies that are translating knowledge into evidence and into policy domains. So that might be an institution in a parliament, or a body that sits outside a parliament but has a formal relationship to it, or a body within an agency, or someone in some kind of executive government somewhere. And there are lots of them out there, and they work in a whole bunch of different ways, and I'll come back to them in a second. Populism is a really slippery thing to kind of wrap your hands around, but at its heart is at some level there's a competition going on between elites and the people. It's elites versus the people is kind of at the heart of it, and that's where we're coming from, myself, my colleagues in this commentary. And our basic thesis is that the science advisory systems that we have in place today evolved under the sort of working assumption that everything was working as liberal democracies. And in an age of populism, those systems really aren't fit for purpose anymore. They need to adjust. And we are putting forward 5 recommendations for the kind of changes that need to take place. So the first is that we need to institutionalize participatory advisory structures. So a lot of the models at the moment are very elitist. There's a bunch of people who know stuff, let's plug their knowledge into a policy decision, and then it'll be fine, and the people will just be grateful for the fact that we're making smart decisions. That flies in some countries, like the UK, with a very elitist structure historically, but it simply isn't flying in a populist context, and it's part of what's driving populism. This sort of what I think Mark was saying about the fact that elites do tend to think of themselves above the people. Like that, it's a real thing that happens, and it's a really unhelpful process. So there is a movement called Parliamentary Technology Assessment that started in Denmark in the 1980s that has built up a whole body of knowledge about how to do science advice in a participatory way, to bring publics, third sector, policymakers and so on, stakeholders, into the advisory process itself, not just as a sort of a market research function, but as participants in the advisory process. Now, some of those bodies exist, and we can learn a lot from them, but it's going to mean new bodies, and it's going to mean that the current bodies in a science advisory context evolve. Historically, in the UK, participatory methods have been something like a solution looking for a problem. I would suggest populism is the problem, and we need to embrace participatory models ASAP. The second recommendation is that we need to widen participation in all stages of knowledge creation and use. So not just in this intermediary function, but in the knowledge creation itself and in the use. We need to transition to stop thinking of the public as recipients, but to participants, and scientists from communicators to facilitators in that process. The third recommendation is we want to include broader forms of knowledge and evidence at the science policy interface. There's a sort of assumption of scientific dominance in epistemology, which sort of isn't borne out by the reality, especially if you're making policy decisions. We need new language that moves on from facts versus opinions. It's just not terribly helpful. And we want to change the status of non-academics from sort of recipients of knowledge to people who also have knowledge. They are in an enormously wide range of ways knowledgeable. Everyone from practitioners through to policymakers, people in the third sector, members of the public, and there's lots of work on that. Our fourth follows on from that, which is to build relationships based on humility, honesty, and transparency. This builds on research that relationships at the science policy interface are everything when it comes to building good science advisory systems, and builds on the knowledge that we all have that science informs and does not necessarily decide on these big political issues. It's something we repeat to ourselves but don't often put in practice. And then the fifth is beautifully titled More, More, More. So we've talked about the quality of this stuff, but actually quantity matters too. the charity sector, for example, in the UK Parliament knows that flooding the zone works. It's a great way to get your information across. And science advice has historically been elitist and targeted, and not embraced the idea that they just need to get out there and do more stuff. We need more analysts, more intermediaries, more policy briefs, more knowledge translation, more training of scientists and policymakers. And we need many more working incentives to get academics involved in societal needs, including communicating science to policy and working with policymakers and the public more broadly. And my final thought for the commentary, and I think from what everyone said, it might be a summary for what we're all thinking, which is the public will start trusting elites when the elites start trusting the public.
Fantastic. So Steve Bannon many years ago said, flood the zone with shit, and yours is flood the zone with gold, or something opposite, I guess.
Yes, I agree with Steve Bannon.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask two rapid fire questions and ask you each for a very brief comment on it, and then we're going to open up for conversation with all of you. So we've been talking at one end are the sort of tactics of how you talk in a non-patronizing way, perhaps with a good relationship. You don't try and head off misinformation head on, but perhaps at an angle. You try and make things relevant. So first of all, a comment just on one or two thoughts on what tactics we need perhaps differently from 20 years ago. And then a second round, much more, and I'll introduce it, on sort of structures and laws and systems. But perhaps we want to start on the tactical advice of how to communicate in this slightly different era. Maybe Mark, you could kick off.
Lots and lots of thoughts on that, but just a couple of points maybe to bring out. I think building on that theme of trusting the public and not taking that sort of condescending "we know better" view, because that if there's one thing that puts us in a hole to start with, it's that one. We're not starting from a great position of trust in terms of who we are demographically, in terms of people who care about science, who value evidence. We all come from basically the same demographic backgrounds. We all have degrees. We all live in towns and cities. Very few on the political right, etc. That puts us at a disadvantage. And first thing we need to do is to recognise and realise that. If we realise that, and we realise that most people are not necessarily the kind of people who share our intuitive ways of looking at the world, we might have a chance of communicating with them in a way that actually resonates, makes us relatable, creates common ground, does all the things that Alok was talking about, that actually makes people open to the idea that they might be persuadable, influenced, that their minds are going to change.
Alok.
I think that being willing to understand that the rules that make a scientific fact a fact are not the same as what persuade people in the real world. That's all. So, if you have statistics and data to show something, then and you can publish it in a paper, you might well win your Nobel Prize or whatever it is. But for the vast majority of people, those rules are not what the rules are when it comes to being persuaded about something at all. Just remember that. Just go back to being a kind person, a nice person, a thoughtful person, just in the way that you might think about being persuaded about anything at all. And that's where you start from. And the data and all of that stuff comes much later.
One of the things, I think, when I was asked to write this book, I was building on a book from the kind of early 2000s. I won't name which one. And I listened back to it, and it was the whole yay geek science. And I am absolutely not a geek. I'm from Liverpool. I do not put that term on myself at all. And listening back, it was like, yay, we're a geek club. We're the scientists. And I listened back to it, and it left me cold. Listened to it on audiobook. And I thought, that's not what I want to do. So I spent a lot of time, did about 200 interviews for the book, as well as about 600 kind of papers, news or grey literature, etc., etc. And the thing that came up repeatedly was being heard and understood. Okay, I'm talking about very much a healthcare setting here, but that came up repeatedly, not patronised. Both Alok and I worked on ITV News, where you're talking to a kind of very different demographic to perhaps I'm talking to when I'm right for the BMJ. but people don't want to be patronised. People, have conversations, and in some ways it's a bit of an anathema. If I go back to Liverpool, like I have this weekend, talk to my family, I talk to them in day-to-day. None of them are scientists. Well, my dad is, but no one else is. You talk to them, day-to-day language. They've got really interesting questions to ask and listen and have a dialogue. And I think the fact that we're even having to think about this seems to me quite bizarre, because that's just what you do, isn't it? You have conversations, you explain, you listen, you respond, you don't patronise, you have a banter, you have a laugh. You're just a normal human being. So somewhere it feels that science perhaps maybe has lost its way, or science journalism has lost its way. And the other thing is, building again what Alok has said, is the idea that data, stats, etc., living in a world of social media. I keep calling it parasympathetic relationships, but it's not the nervous system. Parasocial relationships where influencers know how to get their information across. And in some ways, we have to learn, how do you do that in I want to be sick of my own mouth right now, but an evidence-based way? How do you communicate in a way that lands? It mightn't be scientists are the right people on that platform, but that is something that we need to think about and work out, I think.
Tracey.
Okay, I think it's always great when you discover that your home crowd is screwing stuff up, right? Because it gives you a lot of stuff to do, and we can all we can tell everybody off a lot. And it's true, here on the watch of all of us who've been concerned with public engagement for years, we've got like the naughties on steroids when it comes to radical tech with AI and Symbio and all these things. And yet we have a public completely unprepared for it. They haven't been equipped with the questions to ask. And there have been some really great stuff, initiatives going on, but we aren't ready. And so we also have a public for whom power is really obscure in our institutions. So there's a lot of work that we could do while we're wringing our hands about populism. There's a lot of work we could do to expose the fact that the Lambeth Council that wants you to have a COVID vaccine is somewhat a little bit different from the Lambeth Council that's just been found on the third inquiry into the child abuse scandal to have covered it up, because actually from the point of view of the public, that's the same authority, literally within 6 weeks of each other, with 2 pieces of news headline in the local area, right? And so we could do an awful lot to expose how power works and how different parts of it work, and where science and research might interact with that. So there's stuff to do, but I think it's important to ask something of both sides, which is what I did pick that up a bit in what Alok was saying. You are asking the public to step up too, right? We don't just flatter any old crap. I said to my cousin about a year ago, I said, if you genuinely think that people are out there capturing our kids from children's homes right now, why are you ordering a sodding Domino's and just sitting in front of the telly? Take yourself seriously. And I think we can ask people to take themselves seriously in their interactions. We can say, actually, you have to step up a bit too and figure this out. It takes something of all of us. So I think instead of going from one to the other, like flatter the public, hate the public, I think it's just asking, these discussions are hard, right? It's hard to decide some of these things, like what works, what's fair. And so to have a good discussion, we all have to bring our best selves. And I think that's the best of journalism does that.
I bet your Christmases are fun.
Helen.
Loud. I want to pick up on Deborah's really good point, actually, about approaching this in an evidence-based way, because I think that's really important. I think there's a real risk that we all sit around not being scientists as we think about this problem, and we're all coming up with a bunch of advice and anecdotes which haven't been tested. So the field that I've looked at, which I think has taken a really interesting approach to this, is around people who study vaccine hesitancy. So I wrote a story and interviewed. We wanted to write for Nature's audience because we got the impression that with this, all the misinformation about vaccines, a lot of scientists, and I would include myself in this, you can get in the playground and be standing next to someone who starts to question vaccines and you don't know what to say. And so I wanted to answer that question for myself and our audience. So I wrote this piece called How to Speak to a Vaccine Skeptic, where I spoke to social scientists who've studied this problem, and of course they have echoed everything we've just said on this stage. But the answer, which has actually been tested, is listen, don't judge or dismiss people. People have completely valid and legitimate questions about vaccines, and why shouldn't they? Ask questions. be curious, try to understand where their concerns come from, and then, rather obviously, offer some accurate information if you know it, which might be as simple as, well, the benefits of vaccines in general outweigh the risks for most people. And acknowledge uncertainties as we've discussed. But the other thing I thought was very empowering was, sometimes you can feel paralysed because you don't really know the data. I mean, I don't know all the data on the latest MMR studies, but it was okay to say to offer your opinion actually as a person and say, well, I chose to vaccinate my children because I did think that the benefits outweigh the risks. And some of those tactics have actually been tested in randomized controlled trials in a technique called motivational interviewing and other ways. And I think that's really powerful, is we need to work out those tactics and start to work out how we can adopt them in other places.
That's good. You're leaning on the research, because I'm not going to lean on any research at all. Just to sort of experience. But just to mention, I'm actually got a co-authoring a book that's coming out next year on communicating science in public policy domains, which touches on a lot of these kind of tactical issues, how to do it. Just thinking back to my days of actually doing science advice in Parliament, one of the things that we quite often found is that as you try and encourage people to strip out jargon, which is absolutely essential when you're communicating to a non-expert audience, people then try to also strip out content and complexity, and that's, you don't need to. You just need to strip out the jargon, and it's a difficult thing to learn how to do, but it's, I'm talking to a bunch of journos, you guys know how to do it, but it's tough teaching scientists to do it.
So all that you've said definitely echoes with me. I live in Luton, and most of my neighbours are not university educated. They believe the most crazy conspiracy theories, many of them, and we have the most wonderful conversations and arguments. Half were definitely vaccine skeptics, climate skeptics, you name it. And I do think one has to engage with the argument. Often they're very knowledgeable. I mean, that's one of the things which isn't realised about people who believe conspiracy theories seriously. They've often have done quite a lot of research and have data. The one I can never quite handle, though, is when they say, but my influencer has 20 million followers, that's why I believe them. And it's a different currency from our currency here. So just before we open up, just very briefly, none of you have mentioned law or regulation or policy. I'm one of the advocates that there should be laws penalising knowingly spreading lies, which no one in the British media will even contemplate, although in other parts of Europe it's being taken quite seriously. So is there any role for law and regulation in what we've talked about, or should parliaments and governments keep absolutely out of all of this? So just very brief comments if any of you want to either advocate or say why there shouldn't be any role for, as it were, structural systemic interventions.
Do you want to go back round this way?
Not everyone has to say it.
Okay.
Only if Tracey's got something to say on this.
Yeah. I'm finding myself changing my mind, right? Which is, I'm quite a sort of pro-freedom sort of inclination, particularly in debates where people have got to get a lot off their chests. But I am finding myself increasingly wanting tech to become publishers. And I think that they should be legally redefined as publishers. If they're putting together unique groups of bits of information to produce for you an answer about whether it's okay to give an under one aspirin, then I think they have published something. And so I think the use of AI makes big tech publishers. And they've got a business model that means that they will constantly generate things.
So Mark,
that's the business model.
you've got a comment? Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting approach to it. What I think we have to be super careful about is anything that can be interpreted as suppression of alternative views. Who decides what good evidence is? And something I think is really important here, there's such a thing as what Dan Williams, philosopher, calls highbrow misinformation as well. Look that up. There's an amazing Substack post that he's written about it. There's a lot of highbrow misinformation out there, often to promote things that we would regard as sort of broadly evidence-based, but actually this particular bit isn't. And it undermines trust so much.
Okay, the one slight counter view is the US courts are about to decide whether Brigitte Macron is a man or not. And they will look at evidence and they will make a decision. Just as Fox Dominion's court case over voting machines in 2020, the courts decided Fox had knowingly spread a lie and they had to pay an $800 million fine. So the courts actually do have quite a good track record sometimes of deciding what is true or not. Can I suggest we spend 1 minute or 2 minutes, just talk to the person next to you. what have you heard that you thought was right or wrong, or what's missing, so that we can use our final half hour or so to respond to you. So just talk to, hopefully, a stranger you're sitting next to, and just chat for a minute or two.
It's a brass side table. The table's all brass side. Okay,
Feeling faster than 1 o'clock. Now 3 in the morning. Yeah, that's right.
I worry that we're all agreeing.
That's what I was trying to say. The whole thing.
No, we'll give you.
Try and collect some. Oh, you've got a mic too. Ah, wonderful. So anyone put their hand up of something which came up in your conversation you want to share? There's two at the back. Yeah.
Hi. So we were talking about how sometimes the language that's used in science doesn't always address the concerns that people have. And an example that came up and made me think of that is that I had been talking to a family member who's a vaccine skeptic. And we were getting to quite a good point with explaining things. And then I said, this might be because of this, or it was, the risks might be because of that. And I think coming from STEM, you're almost trained to do that, to acknowledge uncertainty. But then when that's communicated to the public, it almost worsens those concerns, because they're like, oh, you're not sure, you don't know, why should I trust you? When in reality, that's often used in STEM in cases when we just don't have 100% certainty, which is all of the time.
So not now, but in a moment, if one of you could answer that question, and the point I was trying to ask about whether different parts of the public have very different appetites for uncertainty. Who's next there? Yeah, let's take a few.
Yeah, so we were talking about how all the points that have been made are entirely valid. Around like, okay, we need
some disagreement here, sorry.
Okay, well, so I think one thing that hasn't necessarily been like explicitly talked about here is when we encounter people who are vaccine skeptics or the people that we're talking about engaging with here in the general public, and they present the same type of pretentious attitude towards us in conversation that we're kind of talking about stepping down from in this this conversation thus far. Like, how do we engage with that? Because I think a lot of them may or may not also have the same type of attitude that we have, I guess, or that scientists have. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay. Here we've got...
I was wondering, in terms of when people go to an automobile mechanic, for instance, there isn't a sense of seeing this person as an elite person, although they have very specialized knowledge. You know, if you go to a gardener or a driving instructor, that's someone who has a proved degree and a proved ability to teach driving. And so the question is, why is science different from this? You know, and I go back to your statement about when the elites trust the public, then the public will trust the elites. And I'm wondering why elites appears in that phrase, you know, and why can't we sort of think about people who have special knowledge of one thing, whether it's automobile mechanics or it is
doctors,
vaccines.
GPs maybe.
Yeah, and sort of get rid of this idea that it corresponds to a hierarchical level.
Okay.
Thank you a lot for your valuable insights. We've been listening so far to how we can deal with the problem, how we can react to this rise of misinformation in this populism age. But we think here that the problem is more deeper and more structural. So how about proactive action? It's no longer about reaction, how to deal. I think that this misinformation is going to shape the future. It's just the beginning of the populism and the misinformation and how we use it to spread whatever we want. But I think that we have to think more forward about how can we deal with this. Yeah.
Can I just do a quick poll, non-scientific poll, but roughly, is this getting worse in 5 years' time, better, or the same? So who thinks things probably will be better, that we'll have sort of sorted it out, we'll have found all these brilliant communicators? So who's on the optimistic side? One. Who thinks worse? And who thinks roughly the same? Okay, quite a few. Sorry?
Now do it for 20 years.
And, okay, would anyone change their vote for 20 years? Okay, how? You think it's going to get worse then better? Okay, that's a nice view. Okay, you've got the mic.
Thank you. Okay, so my name is Milo. I'm at the Research Institute at Rory, and I'm coming from Africa, and from a context where people believe in their traditional and cultural beliefs. For instance, people believe that you can send lightning and someone dies, and there is actually a paper where someone was saying lightning was sent and the person was charged in court, and yeah. So how do you change perceptions of such people who are strongly rooted on their cultural and traditional beliefs? I think this is something that wasn't talked about, maybe, yeah.
Hi, 2 points, I guess. One, in terms of places that I found in my research where we can learn about, ways to talk to the public, engage with the public. Some of the people I interviewed, I won't give the spiel about my research, but were people who were like associate directors of public health, people that work with the public in general, and they talked about having these kinds of conversations with people during the pandemic and saying that we have to kind of change what success looks like in terms of having these conversations, and that you're probably not going to change somebody's mind the very first time, but it is a bit of a gradual process in terms of meeting people where they're at, and I found that very useful. But secondly, I would say that often, this conversation about democratizing knowledge, we've been having it in academia for eons, and I feel like we kind of fail always at the first hurdle. For example, we've got this event and none of the public are here. So,
You're all members of the public, I think.
Well, we are all members of the public, but it's probably not the kind of public that we're conceptualizing here. And we tend to do this over and over again to kind of, how do we break out of these cycles?
So what's your insight, let's say, for a mass broadcaster, ITN, BBC, which can't have repeated one-to-one conversations? What should they be doing differently?
How do you mean?
Well, I was saying, if you've got an audience of 5 million or 10 million on the evening news or whatever, you can't have the kind of trust-building, ongoing relational conversations which you were mentioning there. So what should you be doing differently?
Well, I mean, I've never worked for a broadcaster, so I don't think my insights would be that useful there. But I think certainly, at least for researchers, where we do have the capacity to have some of these conversations where we open up, you know, who sits on the panel, who gives their perspective. For example, we've talked about research, the research about public says X, which is useful, but we could also have members of the public here to tell us what they think and to respond to that in real time and see how these conversations kind of happen live. Because, you know, all the caveats around how we do research in terms of who do we select, who participates, etc. You know.
Okay, so in a moment I'll bring you all back. Just before, we've got lots of hands up, and perhaps if anyone's got a specific sort of suggestion which hasn't been made, and you can make it very pithily, please do so. But
so I have a little bit of a suggestion, but the main issue for me is that in the populist age, even if experts are shouting, no one's listening. So one of the issues with the Trump administration, for example, in the first round was that experts were saying, we're telling him, we're giving him everything he needs, but he's just not reading the briefings, he's not listening, he's not doing. So then in those instances, what do you do? And the goal should be to build a science advisory system that can withstand populist movements and populist leaders. And one of the ways that I think we can do this is what Tracey and Deborah mentioned, was follow the money and equip the skeptic of the people. And I think one of the best ways that you can do that is by improving transparency in your own research as scientists and in the transparency of the funding networks of these leaders. So if Trump's coming out and saying Tylenol's giving your infants autism, who are Trump's greatest supporters, and are they investing in any of Tylenol's competitors? You don't need to make a comment on it. Just put that out there as a graph on social media. Let the public speak for themselves on that. You know, doing something like this is visualization, is clear cut. You're doing the science behind it, and also you're proving your own funding streams. We're being funded by this public authority. We've been getting money from this person. We have no vested interest whether your mom is taking Tylenol or not. Like, this is something that I think would be helpful. So I think leveraging social media for more, flooding the market with more of your research in an accessible and understandable way will help you win in the court of public opinion. And then hopefully you can withstand these populist ages, because if you're going to appeal to them, it's not really going to work.
Hello, my name's Helen Buckley-Woods. I work for the Research on Research Institute. One professional group that hasn't been mentioned so far are library and information scientists. I worked for a long time as a librarian. I was trained in information management before I became a researcher. And the problems that we're talking about here are absolute bread and butter work that librarians do. So what's the provenance of information? How do you understand information online? How do you differentiate between different types of knowledge? What's the bias behind something? Who's written something? Who's funded something? And so I think that's, you know, that kind of digital literacy training or information literacy training is really, really important, and those people are experts in that kind of work. And so we don't want to be about STEaPP and other bodies who are doing that work, research into that area, and also professionals who are doing that on the ground.
Thanks. Actually, one other group that hasn't been mentioned is schools. So in some countries, certainly in Scandinavia, school kids have a lot of lessons now on misinformation, how to interpret it, how to spot it, how to test it. British schools, I talk often in British schools, they almost get nothing of that kind at the moment. So they're quite easy to manipulate. Right, should we take some, you can choose whichever comments you want to agree with, disagree with, take further. Who's going to start? Yeah, Helen.
Well, I will, because I was going to exactly raise what you just said and speak to the brilliant point about how do we get proactive rather than reactive. Because I think that's really important. I've interviewed lots and lots of people across multiple fields who are all trying to get evidence used and all mostly just churning out evidence running up against this problem. And some of them have just, this is one example, but sort of given up on adults. It's like, we can't get adults to change what they do, so let's focus on children. And this is just, this concrete example is this amazing work by a researcher called Andy Oxman, who was there for the beginning of evidence-based medicine. But he has developed a course basically a critical thinking course for children, which is specifically designed to help them filter kind of bullshit health claims from legitimate health claims. And it teaches them, I mean, it's a wonderful course. I've read the textbook, teaches them to understand that in order to know if something is effective, it needs to be compared to a group which hasn't taken that particular treatment. You know, big studies are better than small ones. These really basic concepts. But they didn't just develop the course, they actually went and tested it in a randomized controlled trial in Africa. They've done multiple trials now and shown that the children were able to better detect misinformation or dodgy health claims after taking this course. And some of them were correcting their parents after this. And he's expanded it. So I just think that's an amazing... I was so inspired by this. I was like, why is every school in the world not teaching this? Because that has to be it, doesn't it? That we're starting to arm the next generation with the tools they need to live in this really complicated world.
So how many schools in Britain are doing this?
I assume 0 based on what you just said.
That was not a scientific comment, my comment. But yours could be the reason why things could get worse for 5 years but then get better in 20 years if a new cadres come out of schools armed with that power to resist manipulation. Tracey?
Yeah, but it doesn't last, and that's the thing, is that because your information is social, so all the pre-bunking work that Zander van der Linden's done and everything else, it doesn't last, and you can't scale it. You can't and keep burdening teachers all the time to try and fix society in this way for 10 years. I mean, you know, I just think the issue is relationships. It's our relationships in many places in society have broken. Our relationships to old political norms and parties and activities, and what we have is we're fixing relationships really quickly all the time with bits of information on social media platforms. Right, our relationships have changed, and I think Rokio's absolutely right. You know, ultimately, I mean, you can't necessarily invest everything in every discussion, but it is about relationships, two-way relationships, listening to people, and so on. And I think it's a crisis of relationships, not a crisis of information, that we're really experiencing here. The good side, though, Geoff, is that people are naturally pattern spotters, and we tire quite easily of seeing, you know, influencers or whoever using the same old reels, and we're quite quickly sceptical. We know how to say that's clickbait, mate. No one taught us in school how to say that's clickbait. That spontaneously erupted as a sceptical way of understanding the world, right? We're good at that stuff. The problem is we might end up trusting nothing. And that's our biggest worry.
So just a couple of data points. Elon Musk says Britain's about on the brink of civil war. I actually checked some data on questions like, do people trust their neighbours? Do they get on with people of different nationalities? The current UK numbers are significantly better than 20 years ago on many of those measures of interpersonal trust. So it's something rather more specific going on here. It's not a generalised collapse of relationships or trust. No. Deborah?
So I think I'm picking up on the first point about uncertainty. You can communicate uncertainty. I've got an example. I had to do it constantly in the pandemic. I was on Newsnight. I was the health person on Newsnight right throughout the pandemic. It was hell. I'm not going to lie. It was some of the hardest report, and I've done some fairly thorny reporting. She says about to dive into the puberty blocker trial. But anyway, so it was polarised. We know it was polarised. And I was sort of slap bang somewhere in the middle because I thought, we're not going to eliminate this virus. Quite early on, I think that was fairly clear. And then on the flip side, it clearly was killing people. It clearly was killing people. Now, what do you do in such a polarised debate? Well, you listen. You listen, you reflect. You try and follow the evidence. You explain the level of evidence. Obviously, I was attacked constantly by either side. But it sort of, you know, you explain this trade-offs. Okay, it's a Newsnight audience, but actually they're the worst because they get drunk and then they're the kind of Twitterati and they abuse you on Twitter. It's far easier on ITV News than it is on Newsnight. But I remember, and there was one particular story, and it was the Pfizer. It's vaccines. I hate reporting on vaccines because benefits, harms, uncertainties, etc., we have to acknowledge that applies to all medical interventions, whether that is a policy like lockdown or whether that is a vaccine or a drug. And we seem more comfortable to talk about it when it's a drug. And it was the Pfizer phase 3 trial, and it was the note to investors. Normally, as a health journalist, science journalist, you don't touch them. But everybody wanted something. Everybody wanted hope. How are we going to get out of this quagmire? And the programme editor phoned me up and said, everybody was on all the newspapers, New York Times, Guardian, etc., etc. Have to say the reporting on it was, and these are friends, colleagues, it was terrible. But the programme editor phoned me and said, Deb, we want you to report on this press release. And I said, I can't, it's only an update to investors. And he was like, shut up, get your ass in, you're reporting on it, everybody's talking about it. And I looked at the press release and I was like, 95% efficacy endpoint. What does that even mean? You look at the press release, it says preventing 95% of COVID infections. Was it? So I didn't even know what was the primary endpoint. But that was how it was being reported faithfully. I had a bit of a meltdown, thinking, I don't even know what this means. So I fortunately had Stephen Evans, who's a professor of pharmacoepidemiology at the London School of Hygiene, on speed dial. And I said, what the heck am I going to do with this? Because I have not seen the full clinical trial. I cannot, in all conscience, stand up in front of an audience and say, I have not seen, this is what the clinical trial data show, when I've not seen it. That would be misleading my audience. And we looked at clinical, you're all aware of clinicaltrials.gov. So clinicaltrials.gov is where trials are registered, and you have to be registered if you're going to get a drug or an intervention through the FDA or in a medical journal. So we looked at what the primary efficacy endpoint was there, and it was symptomatic COVID that had been confirmed in a test. It said nothing about asymptomatic COVID. So made a decision, and I was really nervous about it, to do a piece on Newsnight and said, this is what a Pfizer press release has told me today. 95% efficacy endpoint. What does that mean? That means show your working, as Alok said, go on to clinicaltrials.gov, this is what it says. This is what we don't know. We do not know whether it prevents asymptomatic infection. We do not know whether it prevents transmission. It does not tell me about the kind of range of uncertainty for different age groups, and I can't tell you about all the adverse effects. And I put it out, and I was absolutely so worried about doing it. And I said, and you do live in the studio, and as soon as I have more information, when I've seen the full data set, I will update you. And I was so nervous about doing it. And I got some abuse on social media, inevitably, you're fueling the anti-vaxxers. But actually, a lot of scientists and doctors contacted me and said, thanks, that's really clarified things for us. But if you looked at the press, it was 95% going to prevent COVID. Now, what does that do to trust? What does that do? Oh, I've had my vaccine. Oh, I've got an infection.
And what happened to that 95% over the year or two after?
Oh, I hid, Geoff. I've done
because it went slowly downwards, didn't it?
Yeah. But it was, but you looked at the sample size, and it was who it was actually tested. And obviously you had a big population, but actually COVID infected was actually very small. Yeah. So, you kind of had, and I just had to be honest. And it was one of the scariest things. I've done quite a few scary bits of scary reporting, but that was really, really scary because it's vaccines. But I think it's a case of we have to get our own house in order as well as scientists and public health practitioners and stuff.
And the British public, I think, myself included, are quite confused at the moment of what the right answer is for a 25-year-old, or why are we not getting vaccines, and what actually did we learn from this extraordinary experience. So, Mark, you've got the answer to that.
No, I haven't. I was going to pick up some of the earlier questions. The man at the back who was asking about if you're feeling patronised by the other side, and also the woman in the middle who was talking about traditional and cultural beliefs. And I might be able to offer something to both, but I should preface this by saying I'm extremely bad at this personally, so take it as you see. But I think it's really important within this to recognise most people are very tribal. We are a very tribal, groupish species. We are animals that like to think of being part of a team or a group, and to conform to the social norms of that group, whatever that group is. But it's also perfectly possible to break through that. And what you need to do is to find some form of common ground where you can be part of the same tribe, part of the same group, build a rapport and build a connection with somebody who may disagree with you on a lot of other things, find the common ground. And I think in each of these cases, it's almost about find out where that common ground is. Talk to them about something else. Form the rapport around something that is a shared, something that you share, something that you can both relate to. And it then leaves you in a position where that person might start to listen to you about something else, or may not even consciously start to do that, but may think, well, actually, this person who I've just bonded with over football or music or something like that, maybe what they're saying about this is worth giving some time of day to as well. And it might take some time, but the more that we can sort of avoid getting into a very kind of adversarial group conflict over things, and the more that we can try to build common ground, I think the more we'll succeed.
Yeah, so the more the conversations are slightly at a tangent. I mean, no one likes being told they're wrong, they're stupid, they're an idiot, they're believing, you know, a hoax,
I guess I'd add, particularly in relation to your comment, there was a wonderful piece that Ella Al-Shamahi, the BBC presenter, wrote recently about losing her creationist beliefs, and actually how deeply unsettling and troubling that had been for her culturally, because it was what all her friends and family believed. And actually she's incredibly unusual in that respect, because generally speaking, if you ask people to choose between evidence and their values, their culture, their family, their social norms, they'll always choose the latter. And so it's how do we give people the space to be able to entertain the idea that evidence doesn't necessarily challenge all of that.
Yeah. So we've got time, very brief final comments from anyone who wants to make one. Chris,
sure, yeah. I just want to touch on the why elites. I don't have an answer for you other than to say it varies depending on where you are. It's deeply historical, and it's very sort of culturally normative in lots of different places. And it's been really interesting pulling together this commentary, working with people from all over the world, because there are some pretty common traits across, say, Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa and so on. And you can make some general comments about those places. But then when you look within those places, it gets more complicated again. You know, Botswana and Zimbabwe have very different experiences of elites versus publics and so on. So, yes, it's a good question. We don't have, I don't think, particularly good answers, but it is way more complicated than most people give it credit for. And then I wanted to touch on the question about sort of hyper-local or traditional knowledge. It's a really interesting one. I was actually trained as an anthropologist. It's very close to my heart as a question. And there's sort of a couple of examples to throw at you. One is basically work more with archaeologists. When Ebola crisis was happening, there were ritualistic funerary processes that would last multiple days and involved people touching the corpses. And the medical staff said, you've got to stop doing that. And the locals said, piss off. And they had to get the anthropologist in. And when it was explained, people did stop doing it. And they did manage to stop the spread of the disease. But it had to be explained by people who understood the people. It couldn't just be a top-down, you do that. And another good example about this is where this happens all the time, is local knowledge gets dismissed because it's framed in a way that doesn't make sense to someone with a degree and from a city. So you might be building a road and the locals will say, well, you know, the gods will wash that out in the summer or whatever, and it gets dismissed because it's dressed up as supernatural, but actually they know something, and you need to be able to build in that local knowledge. So that's really what I was talking about earlier when I was saying we need to build in a wider conception of knowledge and evidence when we're talking about science advice.
We've just published The People's Case for Good Curators, which is all about celebrating and giving more voices to people in the information architecture, which includes librarians, investigative journalists, research integrity officers, lots of people who just help us on our journey to answer. And in fact, it's led to a bit of a campaign in the States called Truckers for Libraries, which is quite nice. And I just wanted to say something from Mark's point. If you just draw it out to its full ramifications, it's we change our own minds, other people don't change our minds, right? And if you just remember that when you're talking to people, like in Helen's example in the playground, you think, how do I help this person to work on changing their own minds? And that's, I think, so helpful to think of.
I just have one thing to say about why are scientists the elite. It's because they've been put there by people in power. And that's because if you think about the history of science in the 19th century, early 20th century, I mean, just, being very sort of crude about it, it was basically for rich people, and leisure is a leisure activity. It wasn't really a thing that you did if you were serious about making money or anything like that, or having political power. And then in the Second World War, it became a technology race. And then after that, all of the American system set of science was basically set up to fund in a massive amount and put those people in power, put scientists in positions of power, put scientists in positions of power in government, in research, in universities. This is where the modern version of science comes from. It's only about 80 years old, 70 years old. It doesn't exist like this before. So scientists have been put in this position. They also give themselves titles like professor and that sort of thing, and that's another elitist thing to do. And I'm not saying that these things are undeserved, but that's why. It's a purposeful act of putting people like that into positions of power. So that's why they're there.
We are at time, and in a way, this whole conversation comes at, I think, quite a paradoxical moment, because in some respects, and this institution is part of it, there is more science than ever before, more investment in science, more people working as scientists. The zone is flooded to a degree with science much more than 10, 20, 30 years ago. And the trust levels globally of science, which you survey, show it pretty high pretty much everywhere in the world, isn't it? From China and Indonesia.
Most other professions would kill for the levels of trust.
Yeah. And their levels of trust, much higher than civil servants or business leaders, let alone journalists, of course, are way, way down. And politicians, basically zero. So it is not as if this is a straightforward crisis, and yet, as all of you have said, we need a lot of changes of tone, of style, of tactics, and possibly of much more. In a moment, we're about to have, I think, some evidence-based wine. Is that true? Thanks to Wellcome. Before we go, could you please join me in thanking our speakers? And there are at least 2 books to read from panelists, and Chris's piece in a few weeks' time. And lots of other pieces too. So plenty to take away. Thanks.